These are the worst factions or stables in WWE history. Number 10, the Union. This is the closest thing we're ever getting to a union in wrestling. In the spring of 1999, The Big Show, Ken Shamrock, and Test had all been kicked out or left a faction called the Corporation. Mankind had been an adversary of the Corporation, so all four came together to form the Union. At the same time, the Corporation and another faction, the Ministry of Darkness, merged to form a single supergroup called the Corporate Ministry. The idea was for the Union to be the good guys and wage war on the evil Corporate Ministry. The Union would loosely be aligned with several other wrestlers and talents, including Vince McMahon. McMahon had previously been the leader of the Corporation, but like Test, Big Show, and Ken Shamrock, he'd been forced out of the group by his son, Shane McMahon. So there was also a father versus son angle, with Vince being affiliated with the Union and Shane being part of the Corporate Ministry. However, the Union's biggest obstacle was timing. Big Show, Ken Shamrock, Test, and Mankind had their first pay-per-view match as a group at Over the Edge 1999 against four members of the Corporate Ministry. The Union won, but earlier in the night, Owen Hart tragically passed away in a stunt gone wrong. Rightfully so, this overshadowed the Union's pay-per-view debut. Then, 8 days later, Mankind was written off TV since he had to undergo knee surgery. I guess WWE saw the writing on the wall because not long after, it would be revealed that Vince McMahon was still secretly leading the Corporate Ministry as the higher power. After that, the Union quietly disbanded, and it was over as soon as it started. It was just a real nothing faction. But you know what's probably the worst thing about the Union? Its name. The Union was only part of the faction's name. Its full name was the Union of People You Ought to Respect, Son, or Up Yours. Surprisingly, that's not the worst name we're going to hear in this video. But before we get to that, number 9, the Corre. Just like the Union, the Corre had another faction to thank for its formation. In 2010, the Nexus was formed. Led by Wade Barrett, the faction consisted of a bunch of WWE rookies, frustrated by how they had been treated. It's debatable if the group was actually good or not, but at the very least, they were prominently featured and were the biggest heel group in WWE in 2010. Towards the end of the year though, CM Punk overtook the group, becoming its new leader, and Wade Barrett was kicked out. From there, Barrett would partner with Ezekiel Jackson, and also Heath Slater and Justin Gabriel to form the Corre. Or should I say, Corre. Apparently, the only reason it was spelled with 2 R's is that Corre was already trademarked. Anyways, it seemed like the Corre was built to feud with the Nexus, which could have been a pretty sweet rivalry. However, right after the Corre was formed, CM Punk began a feud with Randy Orton, and the Nexus followed. This left Barrett and his group to find purpose on their own, which mainly came in the form of post-match assaults. Now, to WWE's credit, they did put some effort into making the Corre a serious faction. Shortly after the group's formation, Wade Barrett won the Intercontinental Championship, and Heath Slater and Justin Gabriel won the tag team titles. However, that credibility was quickly undermined almost as soon as it was established. At WrestleMania 27, the Corre fought Big Show, Kane, Santino Marella, and Kofi Kingston in an 8-man tag team match, which the Corre lost in under 8 minutes. After that, tempers began to flare within the group, Ezekiel Jackson would be kicked out, and, not long after, Heath Slater and Justin Gabriel walked away. The Corre wasn't an outrageously bad group. The main issue was that they had no one to feud with, and the group ended before it was really given a chance. It also didn't help that they had one of the worst t-shirts in WWE history. Number 8, X Factor. X-Pac holds an interesting distinction as the only wrestler to have been part of the 2 greatest factions in wrestling history, the NWO and DX. Yes, I know Shawn Michaels was technically a part of both, but I don't think his joining the New World Order in 2002 counts. Anyways, with 2 phenomenal factions under his belt, you would think that when he went to start his own group in 2001, it would have at least been decent. But you would be wrong. It all started in February 2001 when Just Incredible aided X-Pac during an attack by Chris Jericho. Soon after, Albert joined in, and X Factor officially formed. Now, the first problem was the pairing. It didn't make any sense, and felt like WWE was just pulling names out of a hat. But that wasn't the group's biggest problem. Just weeks after the faction started, WCW, WWE's main competitor, went out of business. This led to a significant influx of talent, as many WCW wrestlers transitioned to the WWE. On top of that, ECW had also gone out of business recently, meaning that there were all those wrestlers on the roster too. Having a sudden influx of talent didn't make it easy for a new faction like X Factor to stand out, but an even bigger issue was the Invasion storyline. Most of the recently acquired WCW and ECW wrestlers banded together to form the Alliance. with the goal of taking down the WWE. For the majority of 2001, the Alliance was the faction to watch in WWE, causing X Factor to get lost in the shuffle. However, even with all that, the biggest issue X Factor faced was they had nothing going for them. There wasn't anything that the group did that made them special or made fans care about them. WWE tried to get something going by having Albert win the Intercontinental Championship and X-Pac winning both the Light Heavyweight Championship and the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. But none of these worked. After 8 months, the group finally broke up when Just Incredible left to join the Alliance, where he should have been all along, having been a former ECW World Champion. To top it all off, X Factor had one of the worst theme songs in WWE history. Number 7, The New Breed. In 2006, WWE brought back ECW as a third brand. In addition to wrestlers who were part of the original ECW, there were also a number of newer wrestlers on the ECW roster too. 4 of them, Marcus Corre, Matt Striker, Elijah Burke, and Kevin Thorne, ended up forming a faction called The New Breed. The group instantly began a rivalry with several wrestlers from the original ECW, those being Tommy Dreamer, Balls Mahoney, Sabu, The Sandman, and later, Rob Van Dam. The first problem with The New Breed was that the pairing didn't make any sense. Matt Striker and Kevin Thorne didn't really mix with Burke and Corvan, and vice versa. While the group started off competently, winning most of their matches, they took a nosedive after losing to the ECW originals at WrestleMania. It was basically all downhill from there. They lost match after match. They even lost a 3-on-1 handicap match to Bobby Lashley. I get it, the New Breed were heels, bad guys. They usually lose matches, but a new faction has to be given some credibility, and the New Breed never got that. On top of that, the most popular factions in wrestling were usually formed by wrestlers who were already popular. By design, the New Breed was a bunch of wrestlers who hadn't established themselves yet, so the fans didn't have any reason to care about the faction. The group did technically acquire CM Punk later on, who was already very over with the fans. However, he left almost as soon as he joined, which was probably for the best. Once the New Breed ended, all 4 core members were gone within a year, or in Matt Striker's case, transitioned into a non-wrestling role. This isn't the first time being part of a faction has hurt someone's career, but more on that later. Right now, let's look at number 6, Los Boricuas, Disciples of Apocalypse, and the Truth Commission. I'm lumping all 3 of these factions together, mainly because they all sucked for the same reason. In 1997, Farouk was the leader of the Nation of Domination. However, due to internal issues, Farouk decided he had enough and kicked out most of the members, then restarted the Nation of Domination with new recruits. At the same time, Crush and Savio Vega, 2 members that Farouk kicked out of the Nation, formed their own factions. Crush started a biker gang called the Disciples of Apocalypse, or DOA. Savio Vega, on the other hand, started Los Boricuas, which is Spanish for the Puerto Ricans. This kicked off the Gang Wars storyline, with the Nation of Domination, Los Boricuas, and the DOA all fighting to prove they were the superior faction. As these 3 factions were feuding, a 4th faction, the Truth Commission, a paramilitary group from South Africa, was added. On paper, the gang warfare idea seems pretty cool. However, the problem was that it was essentially the same thing repeated over and over again. 2 of the factions would fight, another group would interfere, and the matches would often end in a big brawl. It was cool the first few times, but it quickly grew old, and the rivalry never developed beyond that. Talking about the teams themselves, they just weren't that interesting. Savio Vega and Crush had some history, but they were lower mid-carders, so their being the leaders made their respective groups look and feel second-rate. The Truth Commission had no established members, and WWE didn't do enough to make fans care about them. Another problem, in addition to these 3 factions and the Nation of Domination, there was also D-Generation X and the Hart Foundation. This meant there was a total of 6 factions in WWE simultaneously. Obviously, the groups with the popular main event wrestlers in them were gonna overshadow the ones that didn't. On top of all that, DOA, Los Boricuas, and the Truth Commission just fizzled out. There was no satisfying ending to the Gang Warfare storyline. Plus, almost none of the wrestlers in these groups went on to have notable careers afterwards. It really felt like these 3 factions were a waste and just pointless. But not nearly as pointless as number 5, the Welcoming Committee. You know how I said there was one group with a worse name than Up Yours? Well, there's actually one other, but still, the Welcoming Committee is pretty bad. In April 2017, WWE hosted the Superstar Shakeup, which saw Charlotte Flair move from Raw to SmackDown. Upon her arrival to the new brand, Charlotte demanded a shot at the SmackDown Women's Championship. The SmackDown commissioner, Stephanie McMahon, said that if Flair could defeat the champion, Naomi, in a non-title match, she would get a shot. This angered Natalya, Tamina, and Carmella, who were already on the SmackDown roster, and they felt they should be next in line. The three women weren't going to stand for it, and they attacked Charlotte and Naomi during their title match. They soon called themselves the Welcoming Committee, I guess to welcome newcomers to SmackDown. Anyways, the group later tried to recruit Becky Lynch, but the man ended up joining Naomi and Charlotte Flair, setting up a 6-woman tag team match at the Backlash pay-per-view. The Welcoming Committee won, and while all three women continued to tag together, the faction soon faded away around the time Carmella won the Money in the Bank ladder match. It was such a pointless faction, and it ruined what could have been a much better rivalry between Naomi and Charlotte Flair. I didn't mention this, but Charlotte Flair wasn't the only female wrestler to get drafted from Raw to SmackDown. Tamina was too. Yeah, the faction all about how newcomers were taking their opportunities from them had a newcomer on their team. Obviously, the main reason for the Welcoming Committee's existence was to get Charlotte Flair over as a babyface, a good guy. When a faction is created for the sole purpose of trying to elevate one wrestler, it often doesn't do that, and the faction usually ends up being trash. It was no different with the Welcoming Committee, and wouldn't you know it, but this wasn't the only time WWE tried to do something like this. Allow me to introduce you to number 4, the League of Nations. On paper, this could have been a solid faction. In November 2015, Sheamus had just cashed in his Money in the Bank contract to defeat Roman Reigns, who had just won the WWE Championship. A week later, the two fought in a rematch, but it was interrupted by King Barrett, Rusev, and Alberto Del Rio, who came to Sheamus' aid. These four then created a faction known as the League of Nations. Like I said, on paper, this had potential. You had two former world champions in Sheamus and Alberto Del Rio, Wade Barrett was good on the mic, and Rusev was a relatively new and rising star. So, what went wrong? The sole reason for the League of Nations' failure was that the group had only one objective: to make fans like Roman Reigns. In late 2015, Roman was still failing to connect with at least half of the WWE audience, despite being groomed as the next face of the company. So, WWE thought that making a group of credible villains for Reigns to fight would be the answer. It was not. In their second match as a group, the League of Nations took on Roman Reigns in a 4-on-1 handicap match, and Roman won. Granted, it was by countout, but still, 4 credible opponents can't defeat one guy? Really? Fans could see right through it and knew what WWE was doing. The League of Nations lingered on for a few months before having arguably their biggest moment at WrestleMania 32. They defeated The New Day, but were then attacked by Shawn Michaels, Stone Cold Steve Austin, and Mick Foley. Normally, I'd complain more about that, but it's really not worth it. The night after WrestleMania, Wade Barrett was kicked out for being the weak link, and the group disbanded just a few weeks later. As stated, the biggest flaw of the League of Nations was that it was created simply to help Roman Reigns, and when it didn't do that, the whole thing was dead in the water. Not only did it do no favors for Roman, but it didn't help anyone in the actual faction. In fact, it's arguable that all 4 men were worse off after the League of Nations than before the group started. Now, this next faction didn't help anyone in it either, but for a much different reason. I'm talking about number 3, the NWA. In late 1997, Jeff Jarrett returned to WWE. He gave an infamous speech where, among other things, he criticized WWE for how vulgar it had gotten. At the same time, Jim Cornette was hosting weekly rants, during which he frequently complained about modern wrestling. So, basically what Jim Cornette does today. Additionally, Cornette discussed bringing tradition and class back to the WWE. This led to Jim Cornette bringing the vacant NWA North American Championship to Raw, and then having Jeff Jarrett and Barry Windham compete for it. Jarrett won thanks to interference by Jim Cornette, and the NWA faction was officially formed. 2 weeks later, Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson of the Rock and Roll Express made their return to WWE, where they were awarded the NWA Tag Team Championship, and also became part of this NWA faction. Soon after, Barry Windham joined the group too. You know, the same guy Jim Cornette had attacked, which cost him the North American Championship. Anyway, after a few more weeks, Jeff Jarrett would leave the group, saying he was too talented for it. Then, Cornette would kick the Rock and Roll Express out in favor of Hardcore Holly and Bart Gunn. Cornette claimed Holly and Gunn were the successors to the Midnight Express, arguably the most famous tag team that Jim Cornette ever managed. The NWA faction continued on with Cornette, the new Midnight Express, and Barry Windham. However, things picked up when the NWA World Heavyweight Champion, Dan Severn, joined the cause. But he was only part of the faction for a few weeks before leaving to focus on his singles career. Barry Windham also left the WWE around this time, leaving just Jim Cornette and the new Midnight Express, effectively turning this faction into a tag team. Cornette's group had their final match at the 1998 King of the Ring pay-per-view, where they lost lost to the WWE Tag Team Champions, the New Age Outlaws. From the beginning, the NWA faction was doomed for failure. The idea was to bring wrestling back to its roots, but fans didn't want that. They were much more interested in D-Generation X, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Undertaker, and Kane. So whenever the NWA came on, it just sucked the life out of the crowd. On top of that, fans just didn't really care much about the wrestlers in the faction. To make matters worse, whenever the NWA wrestlers fought the WWE wrestlers, the NWA guys either got defeated or won only through cheating. It just confirmed what fans already felt about the NWA faction, that they were inferior to the WWE wrestlers. I think Right to Censor was a better version of this idea, a group that disliked what the WWE was and sought to reform it. The NWA faction wasn't a bad idea on paper, but once they were in front of a live audience, it was clear it was doomed to fail. The only thing worse would be a faction that could have been successful, but failed simply due to WWE's own incompetence. I'm talking about number 2, Retribution. There is so much wrong with this faction, and one of the reasons is how it started. In August 2020, a group of masked individuals began attacking the WWE Performance Center, the venue where Raw and SmackDown were airing during the pandemic era. They went from taking out a generator to actually invading the show and destroying the ring. It was reminiscent of when the Nexus made its debut 10 years earlier. We didn't know who these hoodlums were, but they said the reason for their attacks was due to injustices in WWE. The identities of Retribution would remain a mystery. That was until WWE had the group change their mask so we could see who they were. Each member was a wrestler from NXT, but the commentators didn't acknowledge them. Did WWE really think fans wouldn't recognize them? NXT was airing on the same network as Raw, for crying out loud. But that wasn't the worst of it. Each member of Retribution was given a new name, and it was either bad or laughably bad. How are we supposed to take a faction with wrestlers like T-Bar and Slapjack seriously? There was a bit of hope when Mustafa Ali was revealed as the mastermind behind Retribution and the leader of the group. He had some understandable motives for doing it, such as feeling frustrated when being held back by WWE. That's a solid and realistic motive, and it sort of works for the other members too, as a lot of them had spent years, a decade, or even longer wrestling, but never given an opportunity. But here's the issue with that. If WWE wanted to go a more serious route, why give them cartoonish names and make them look like villains from a comic book? But with all that said, here's the biggest problem with Retribution. They lost. And they lost a lot. The group was all about causing chaos and showing the establishment they wouldn't be pushed around, but then they would constantly lose matches. It's sort of like what happened to the Nexus, but Retribution had it a lot worse. It's hard for fans to feel like a faction is a threat when they can't back up what they're saying. I know Retribution is considered one of the worst factions in WWE history, and I agree, but I kind of have a soft spot for it. Like, I know the group looked like a gang of Power Rangers villains, but I like Power Rangers. I thought the masks and even the names to an extent were kind of cool, in a cheesy sort of way. But again, the problem was that Retribution was trying to blur that line between fiction and reality, using real-life backstage frustrations as the group's motivation. That doesn't work when the group is presented like villains from a Saturday morning cartoon. Now, who could possibly be worse than Retribution? Well, first, let's go over a few dishonorable mentions. The Mexicools. In 2005, Super Crazy, Psychosis, and Juventud were upset about the state of Mexican Americans, and they had enough. They were done seeing Mexicans do grueling manual labor in the US, which is why they started wearing jumpsuits and riding lawnmowers to the ring. They were fighting against the stereotype by embracing it. I'll let you make of that what you will. Obviously, this faction would never fly today, but the mid-2000s were different. In fact, the Mexicools actually got over with the crowd. Again, I'll let you make of that what you will. Sanity. This faction was great in NXT. They had a cool entrance and look, they were presented as serious threats, and each member had a defined role. So why am I talking about Sanity in this video? Because of their main roster run. In 2018, the group was called up from NXT to SmackDown. However, it wouldn't be until 2 months later that Sanity finally made their main roster debut. Their debut was alright, with them attacking the Usos, but it quickly fell apart. Sanity lost almost every match they had on the main roster, including the first 2 on SmackDown. Literally, the only win the group got while on the main roster was a 6-man tables match at Extreme Rules. This once threatening group became enhancement talent until they were finally apparently broken up almost a year after they were called up. Vince's Devils. This is such a forgotten faction in WWE history that I honestly didn't know about it until I started researching this video. A parody of the TV show Charlie's Angels, Vince's Devils consisted of Victoria, Tori Wilson, and Candice Michelle. The whole faction just felt sleazy and was just an excuse for eye candy segments. Granted, this was kind of where women's wrestling in WWE was at that time, but still. It also felt like a downgrade for a wrestler like Victoria, who could seriously wrestle. Upon revisiting it, I see why Vince's Devils hardly, if ever, get brought up today. With that, let's get into it. The number one worst faction in WWE history is Pretty Mean Sisters. This group holds the distinction of being the first female-led faction in WWE history, but given how awful of a faction it was, I don't know if that's worth celebrating. Pretty Mean Sisters featured 3 members, Jacqueline, Terry, and later Ryan Shamrock, who each had their own reasons for being angry at the men on the WWE roster. If you haven't caught on, the abbreviation for Pretty Mean Sisters was PMS, aka premenstrual syndrome. That was basically the entire faction in a nutshell. A joke about women being angry. It probably doesn't come as a surprise then that it was a man's idea for this faction. On that topic, Pretty Mean Sisters would add a male member to the group. His name was Meat, better known as Sean Stasiak. He was meant to be the group's love slave, and the women would force him to sleep with them. This caused Meat to be exhausted before his matches, and he lacked the energy to win as a result. Yes, this was the Attitude Era, but there's a reason PMS isn't remembered fondly. On the subject of wrestling, every single faction in this video had a match. Pretty Mean Sisters, though, never wrestled. Sure, some of the individual members had matches, but the faction never once competed all together. Yes, this was the Attitude Era, but there's a reason PMS isn't remembered fondly. From the name to the premise, Pretty Mean Sisters is easily, hands down, the worst faction WWE ever created. But what's the worst storyline in WWE history? To find out, watch the video on screen.